Hi, everyone. It's really, really nice to be here. I want to thank Dave and Tessa for the invitation. They're always doing amazing work. I'm always so happy to be involved in what they're doing. And it's my first time doing something with CIVIX, which I think is an amazing initiative. So great to talk to you. I also don't get to talk to teachers that often, even though I research schools and teaching. So thank you for being here. How are we doing?
Yeah.
As Tessa mentioned, I got this gig mainly because I've been working on sex education for a while. So I'm going to be walking you through the sex education parts of the CCQ and helping you figure out what to do with them and what to expect. But I got into this because we had a curriculum in Ontario, I'm from Toronto, that maybe you heard about. It was, what's the right phrase? A gong show for about a decade. And the good thing is that I think there's lessons to be learned there. And I'm going to be giving you some advice and insight on the CCQ based in part on what I learned from studying the catastrophe that happens in Ontario. We did end up with a reasonably good curriculum, like for now, but it was quite the journey. Thank you very much. And this presentation is called Touchy Subject, Teaching the Sexy Parts of the CCQ. Touchy Subject is the name of a book I co-authored, and coming up with that title was clearly the pinnacle of my career. Quick overview of the presentation. So I'm going to try to talk for about 40 minutes, leave about 20 minutes for Q&A, so please definitely hold on to your questions. The three main questions I'll be addressing are: what kind of sex education is in CCQ? If you're not familiar with other curricula, you may not know what this looks like in terms of the range of sex education. What does, sorry to tell you, parental opposition to sex education look like? And then hopefully leaving you with some useful tools. What should you know and how can you respond to controversy? Because where there is sex education, there is controversy. So I mentioned the Ontario experience. This is a now dated graphic from when it was unclear where we were going to go with it. I won't walk you through all the twists and turns. Suffice to say that this meme is a good synthesis of how many twists and turns there were and how utterly confused and hung out to dry Ontario teachers were in 2018 in particular. So I'm very glad that you are not in the same situation in Quebec. But as I said, there are lessons here about what is most controversial, what the controversy looks like, what teachers can do, and I'm going to try to impart some lessons to you. But it's not flipping like that. How do you change the slide? Yeah, but I did it at the bottom there. All right.
Oh, is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah. So as I said, the book that I co-authored with a historian is called Touchy Subject, The History and Philosophy of Sex Education. One of the things that I do in my part of the book at the end is I provide not a curriculum, but a kind of guidelines for what to think about when you're designing sex education. And after I've gone through all this political philosophy and stuff, I say, this is what I think is the best and most justifiable form of sex education in a pluralistic society. And so, like I said, it's not a curriculum, but it has tenets. And I call the whole thing, that's very bland, democratic humanistic sexuality education. The tenets are: it's evidence-based and comprehensive. It promotes sexual health and autonomy, but not particular sexual behaviors, abstinence, or otherwise. And it, this is the good part, includes ethics, civics, critical media studies, arts, and humanities. It is contextual, meaning that it is not going to be a cookie cutter curriculum for all times and places. It must be responsive to the environment in which it is designed and implemented. It is evolving and responsive for the same reasons, because even in a given state, province, school, there will be changes over time that require responses. For example, sex hasn't changed biologically in 20 years, but social media has changed sexual practices, so it has to be responsive. And guess what? The CCQ is amazing. It is like the best curriculum I've seen, in part because it really hits all of those tenets of democratic, humanistic sexuality education. It's not just a sex ed curriculum, and it's not shoehorned into the health and physical education curriculum like it is in Ontario and in most places, where you sort of awkwardly have to bridge like volleyball and talking about, symptoms of STIs. It's embedded in the whole intellectual, political, and cultural context that students need to learn about sex in. It includes sociology, ethics, democracy and citizenship, culture, obviously, and technology. Brilliant. That's a lot to teach. It's a lot. So the first thing I want to tell you is it's great that sexuality education is embedded in all these things and intertwined with all these things. That really follows from at least my long and hard thinking about the best ways of teaching sexuality, as well as plenty of evidence, which I'm not going to bang you over the head with in this presentation. The other thing you should know is this is a lot, and a lot of it is complicated and maybe new to you as a teacher, and you probably, I would say almost certainly, didn't learn it as a student yourself. So there's a real challenge here. I've pulled out the key sexuality content in each grade of the CCQ. Maybe later someone can explain to me why there's no secondary 3 CCQ. Because what? Oh, POP. Ontario foreigner here. It still seems strange to me that wouldn't also be integrated into all. Tell me later.
We have 5 themes, but it's not in CCQ.
So as just your average non-Quebec teacher browser of the internet, I just referred to the main documents, and this is what I got. So I'm not going to run through all of it. I assume you've seen it or can look at it in more detail when the time is right, but this hits kind of all of the main topics in what is now commonly called comprehensive sexuality education. What goes by the name comprehensive sexuality education actually isn't comprehensive, especially in the United States. This is, like I said, much closer to comprehensive. So good job. I'm going to talk in more detail about some of the inclusions and exclusions. Okay, some brilliant inclusions in this curriculum, which you may just sort of gloss over, not be aware of if you haven't studied other sex ed curricula before. I love that it talks about pain and disappointment beyond consent. Now, to give you a little history, consent was not, believe it or not, an obvious thing to include in a sex education curriculum until 10 years ago at most. In Ontario, the only reason consent was added to the education was because of the advocacy of 2 teenage girls who said, we need to talk about how to prevent sexual violence. We know that sexual violence, gender-based violence, rampant problem. There's no silver bullet, but certainly embedding discussions of consent early, and this was before Me Too, seems like a good start. So consent, great. It's hard to teach, but we all know it needs to be there. Here's the problem. Young people, especially those who are presumed to be potential perpetrators of violence, namely boys, are definitely hit over the head with the message, you have to get consent. Anything except an enthusiastic yes is a no. Okay, cool. Doesn't tell them what to do when they get a no. Who are incels but men who have gotten a no and reacted violently? There's lots of evidence of this. We need to do much more holistic emotional coaching. So talking about pain and disappointment, and not just in sexual romantic relationships, but starting in elementary school, is how it makes you feel when you're rejected from a social group, how to deal with rejection, how to respect other people's boundaries. I think that's terrific. AI and sexual communication, starting in secondary. As I said, curricula have to be evolving and responsive. So a few years ago, it was still pretty new to have social media in this kind of curriculum, which is obviously necessary. Now it's obviously necessary to have something on AI. I'm sure that will need to be continuously updated, and you'll need to think about that, but it's in there, and that's a great start. I talked before about the importance of consent, but in the Ontario curriculum, which, like I said, did make a big stride by adding consent in 2015 and then again in 2019, there's no definition of consent, which some of my astute students recently pointed out really begs the question, how are we supposed to teach this? And is it doing the good that we want it to do, especially amidst all these cultural conversations about the gray zones? So in the glossary of the secondary, you will find a definition of consent. It is not the be all and end all, okay? I can give you lots of scholars who disagree on what consent means or should mean, but you have something to refer to. And this is something that I'm just going to stress throughout here. A curriculum document is just a document, okay? We all know that. But it gives you something to refer to, and it gives you cover. So if you teach something and it's from the curriculum and you can point to it, you cannot logically get in trouble. I'm not saying people will never try, but you can't get in trouble. And this has been super important in other places where there's been sort of the gist of a comprehensive sexuality curriculum, but it's not spelled out. And then teachers who implement the spirit of the curriculum get dinged or get challenged because they say a word or something that's not in the curriculum. So having things written down is really important for protecting teachers. Another fascinating and I think brilliant inclusion, which you also may just gloss over. I even wonder how much of this is the translation from French. I read them both, but maybe it's just like a slightly different meaning in French. Mutuality. I literally just taught my students a series of articles debating whether mutuality should be introduced as a higher standard of ethical sex than mere consent. Consent is just like, okay, you have my permission. Mutuality is like an ideal. It's like thinking about what makes sex good as well as plenty of other relationships. That's a beautiful olive branch you have to extend, and you can get into some of the finer points of satisfying sexual relationships, again, with the cover of the curriculum. And finally, as you know, all the way throughout, this is threaded with discussions of human rights, rights that are proper to Quebec citizens, to Canadian citizens, law and justice. Very important for students to understand, both to protect themselves and for you to be able to use to point to the kind of society that we in fact live in. Now, here are some provocative inclusions. They're also brilliant. I'm not saying these aren't brilliant inclusions. I'm just saying let's like take these ones out and put a little warning sign on them, because you can learn from other jurisdictions' experiences that these are more likely to be provocative. Okay, so in 1988, this scholar named Michelle Fine wrote an article that became quite a landmark article called The Missing Discourse of Desire. And it actually has everything to do with consent, because how do you know if you want to say yes or no to something? Especially when this is a very, gender-directed conversation. They never, ever talk to young people about what sexual desire or pleasure, God forbid, pleasure looks like. They call that the P word in sex ed. They don't talk about it, and it is hard to talk about. But unfortunately, you're not really going to make headway on understanding consent or helping young people make informed choices about what they do or don't want to do unless you talk about what desire looks like. Male desire, especially heterosexual male desire, I'm not saying is uncomplicated, but it's ubiquitously represented. Women's desire when it comes to sexuality is, I don't have to rehearse it for you, subject to double standards and shaming and all of that. And it's never been talked about in the vast majority of sex ed curricula, even as they're trying to teach, figure out what you're going to say yes or no to. You have pleasure and desire, including the O word, which never appears in the curriculum in secondary 4. So these are older students, but this is gold, and I don't know, it's fire. It's one of these things that's inflammatory, but also great. You also have the word masturbation in the curriculum. Little cautionary tale, this appeared in the Ontario curriculum in 2015. Some parents seized on it and like, oh my God, they're masturbating in class. No, they're not. Okay. And yet, how can you not talk about this when you're teaching healthy sexuality? No,
The M word.
I'm going to say a lot of words here today. We're all adults. I'm not employed by a school board. I can say what I want. Okay. Masturbation, how can you not talk about it? It is almost every single person in the world's first sexual experience. It is absolutely ubiquitous. It is safe. You are not going to get pregnant. You are not going to get a disease. How can you not talk about it? But generally, they don't talk about it. So just so you know, it's in there. This was referred to in previous presentations, but the fact that egalitarianism and later on even feminism are so explicitly and repeatedly named in discussing like gender stereotypes and equal relationships and so on is, again, a strength and a bit of a provocation in Quebec relative to other curricula. It obviously follows from principles that have a long history in Quebec. And there are also people like Andrew Tate, but also others who find them objectionable, and you have a lot of cover, but this is a much more unapologetic approach to gender equality for a curriculum than most other peer curricula will have. And there's this one phrase that jumped out to me in elementary 5, again, maybe looks innocuous, but children's rights and parental responsibilities. This is one of the most heated debates right now, especially in the US. It's not children's rights and parental responsibilities, it's parents' rights. Thank you very much, some people will say. I'm going to say more about parents' rights in a bit, but just so you know, that is written in there. And some parents who think that it's about parents' rights will comb the curriculum looking for key words. And like I said earlier, draw outlandish and unsubstantiated conclusions about what it means and what they're doing. But in some cases, maybe substantiated conclusions that they just disagree with. And this is a place where I think there's definitely room for provocation. Now, not included in the curriculum, sold separately, which is to say, I hope you still include it. But to me, quite interesting, not mentioned in the curriculum. No specific sexual activities are mentioned in the curriculum, not even intercourse, if my Control F button is working properly, okay? Interesting choice, don't know how that came about. Obviously, it's not a curriculum that says everything, but compared to the Ontario example, again, I wonder if there was a little bit of posturing to avoid certain types of outrage. The word anal sex appeared one time in the Ontario curriculum, one time, and our curriculum is about 4 times longer than yours. And it appeared in the context of a parenthetical list of activities that could result in acquiring HIV, not a positive way of including it. That was the only inclusion, okay? What happened? Parents read this, parents maybe use their Control F button, they see the word anal, they freak out. And then particularly super homophobic people start saying that it's all a gay conspiracy. Kathleen Wynne was Premier of Ontario in 2015. She's openly lesbian. The story writes itself. It was very ugly. Is that a good reason to not mention any sex acts in a curriculum? I don't know. But just so you know, even like penis and vagina sex is not mentioned. I don't even know if those, I don't know what would happen if you said those words even. Condoms, not once. Please tell your students to use condoms. Okay, one of the things that's notable about this is, again, especially in the US where they have a much more anti-sex culture in the form of abstinence-only education, but still reverberates outside the US, is that the classic activity of demonstrating how to put on a condom on a banana, because if you don't use condoms correctly, they won't work, has gotten teachers into a lot of hot water. There's even a story of a teacher being fired in a jurisdiction where they were supposed to be teaching sex ed for putting a condom on a banana. Okay. Whether you use the banana or not, it just does still seem strange to me to not mention condoms at all in a curriculum that obviously has as one of its main goals promoting safer sex. God. Maybe not surprising that in the Quebec, culture curriculum, emphasis on secularism. You can also go next door to learn more about that. There's no mention of God. But interestingly, just as some parents are aghast that certain words or ideas are in the curriculum, other parents or onlookers are aghast that certain words or ideas are not in the curriculum. And for some people, the idea that you could teach about sexuality without God or religion means you've got the whole paradigm wrong. Like you're talking about it the wrong way. Part of what made this complicated in Ontario is our publicly funded Catholic school system, where a third of our students go, and they have constitutional protection to make everything about God and religion. So their entire discussion of sexuality is within the Catholic framework. You also have a lot of Catholics in Quebec. You have people of different religions, and you have people for whom religion may also be inseparable from sexual values and sexual health. Marriage isn't in there except in one place in the context of domestic violence. See above re-anal. Something to think about again, okay? I've also heard during the protests in Ontario that it was just, unconscionable that sex was being talked about outside the context of marriage. Not only that it was, licensing premarital sex or encouraging students to have premarital sex. Don't worry. All the research shows that comprehensive sexuality education does not make kids run out and have sex sooner than they would otherwise. It does not. Just makes it more likely they'll use protection. However, the marriage thing is a big sticking point for some people. And another thing that I thought was interesting is even though it's a very progressive curriculum and there are multiple mentions of LGBTQ identity, there's nothing on non-binary identity. And my understanding is that a large number of, an exponentially larger number of students today than say 5 years ago are identifying as non-binary. And I would probably want to make sure that that's explicit somewhere when you're talking about queer inclusion and diversity of gender expression. Okay, so I've given you a little overview. I've picked out some of the highlights, some of the things to maybe tread lightly on or be aware of, and the things that you may also want to add, even if they're not in there. The whole approach is still really emblematic of what I was advocating in democratic humanistic sexuality education, which is that it is integrated. And you can read this chunk here. This is from the elementary curriculum, but especially this point here that it's a responsibility shared by the entire school staff. Pros and cons, okay? Again, best practices by sex ed researchers and people who know this stuff say, yes, it has to be a shared responsibility. It really just can't be an isolated little afterthought in a subject that nobody wants to teach. That stigmatizes it even more, and it makes it easier to skip over it. We have to spread it out, talk about sexuality in literature, talk about sexuality in social studies, talk about sexuality when you're doing art. Quebec also tried this approach before the CCQ, and the result, from what I understand, was essentially a diffusion of responsibility. And if you've ever taken social psychology, the more people who are responsible for something, the less likely it is to get done, especially if it's a radioactive topic. So while I also encourage all teachers to obtain the competency and the confidence to talk about themes of sexuality in all their subjects, it is still primarily the responsibility of CCQ teachers to make sure that it gets covered. Maybe you can collaborate with other teachers in the school or talk to your administrators about ways of integrating it. But I'm glad that it's also designated in the CCQ curriculum, because the, spread it out approach doesn't work very well. Couple more notable features before I start talking about parents. I love this. It recommends starting and ending a lesson or the whole unit or wherever you're talking about sexuality with positive and less sensitive content. So really sandwiching the more controversial stuff. I think that's just good pedagogy. What a lot of teachers do, especially when sex ed is in the health and phys ed curriculum like it is in Ontario, is they wait till the end of May. And it's like, as the kids have already checked out and the grades are basically in and they're like running out the door and they're like, oh, use condoms, bye. So I think it's important not to hit the ground running before you know your students. Building up a bit of rapport is always conducive to these discussions. But yeah, that's why the sandwich model makes a lot of sense to me. Another, may seem like a sort of arbitrary semantic difference, but I think is actually the result of learning lessons from a lot of controversy and painful policy procedures in other places. The non-mandatory topics, they're not optional. They're recommended. This may seem semantic, but I think it's a big difference. Optional, Ontario tried to have it both ways. Ontario tried to please everybody. Ontario has mandatory content and then like these sort of cute, awkward teacher-student dialogues, which are like suggestions for how you might talk about something. And it can lead to more confusion, and it doesn't quell the worries of the parents who don't want to see it in the curriculum at all. If something says optional, but it's still in the curriculum, parents will say, well, you might talk about it, and I don't want you to talk to my kids about it. I think it's much better to just be honest and say, no, we think this is important. We recommend you talk about it. But, you know, depending on your class and maybe how much time you have, these are the things, the mandatory things you absolutely have to hit. I think it's honest and transparent, and it will absolutely piss off some people. And this also, I'm not going to repeat the last two presentations, but the discussion of teacher neutrality is also fairly unique in CCQ. So I just pulled it out for you here. This is from the secondary curriculum. It really says explicitly that you need to differentiate between common sense knowledge and validated knowledge, blah, blah, blah. You have all day to think about this and talk to others about this, but this is not often included in sex ed curricula. And like I said, sex ed usually isn't put alongside like ethics and sociology and civics, but I think it's great that it is. It does just mean that there's this extra element of figuring out how to position yourself. Not as much of an issue when all you're given to do is like name body parts. Okay, I'm going to move on to probably the parts that you're most worried about, which is what parents who oppose sex education typically do. Okay, very common response is to say that the curriculum is age inappropriate. Okay, we're not saying it's not true or it's bad. We're just saying they're too young. They're too young. Okay. Oh, I had a graphic there that didn't come up. Okay, whatever. What does it mean to say it's age inappropriate? Kids mature at different ages. They mature physically at different ages. They mature emotionally at different ages, and they're interested in different things. There is no age at which every single kid will be ready for exactly the same thing or need exactly the same thing. However, porn doesn't care how old your kid is. The rise of internet pornography and especially smartphones and the unsolicited and very graphic pornographic content that students get on their smartphones is a major driver of more robust comprehensive sexuality curricula. They're going to be exposed to it whether you like it or not. You may think they're young and innocent. The internet doesn't care. Okay, so that's a big part of the backdrop here. It's true that a lot of kids will be really squeamish or say this doesn't apply to me, and a lot of parents will freak out if you start talking to 11-year-olds about various sex acts or sexual consent. 11 is the average age at which most kids are first exposed to pornography. And by pornography, you know, I don't mean Sports Illustrated. I mean what would formerly have been called hardcore pornography, because it's ubiquitous now. So what parents think is age inappropriate, and may be inappropriate for some kids, is unfortunately not the world they're living in. And the response of curriculum designers and people who research sex education has been largely to say, let's take the lowest age at which something is likely to happen or kids are likely to need to know something, and let's just try to hit it early. Because if we miss the boat, they will be educated by very dubious sources instead of us. So innocence is a bit precious in a world where kids have the internet. Parents will often portray the curriculum as state incursion into private family matters, you know, picking up on very long and familiar debates about the proper balance between state authority over education and parental authority over education, public and private, where does religion fit? This is, I'll talk about this a little more in the next couple of slides. Some protesters are very likely to talk about indoctrination, you know, what to some people is sort of a factual and evidence-based curriculum, to another person is propaganda or a conspiracy to, I don't know, make all their kids queer or something like that. But interestingly, in the face of what they call gender ideology and the increasing amount and progressiveness of content about queer inclusion over the last few years, the right has moved to a posture of claiming that they're on the side of science. They say that gender ideology is that, it's ideology, you know, oh, they're teaching my kid there's, you know, 6 genders or like 6 sexes. That's, you know, bullshit. There's 2, it's science. And this has unfortunately pitted some of the more progressive people on queer inclusion issues and some of the more homophobic or conservative people on queer issues in weird camps vis-a-vis science. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but just flagging. They'll certainly appeal to religious freedom, which even in a secular province like Quebec, and Quebec is obviously the most officially secular province in Canada, we still have religious freedom. And some protesters will always say that the very fact of certain content being on the curriculum, or even the very fact of a teacher teaching it to my child in school, violates my religious conscience. Like, I cannot practice my faith the way that I feel I am called to do, and I cannot raise my child in my faith the way I feel I am called to do if this form of education is foisted on me. And that is actually a very significant challenge in a pluralistic society that respects religious freedom, because sure, lots of religions will separate those things and say, no, my religious faith or my practices at home are separate from what happens at school. But there are some people who will say that they are intertwined, and it's not really for someone with a different worldview or religious view to say that they're mistaken because it's a different religious view. It's a question of how you thread that needle at the political level. When all else fails, a lot of parents will opt their kids out. The rules for that vary. In Alberta recently, they've actually changed it all up, so you have to opt your child in to sex ed or anything controversial. Like, your kid will not get any of it unless you opt them in. That is the extreme end of the spectrum. Yes, I cringe face. I feel the same. But almost every jurisdiction, like, in liberal democracies, has some kind of opt-out clause. And when the opt-out clause isn't exercised, some parents, like we saw in Toronto during our controversy, will take their kids out of the public school system. And I think that's a more severe danger, both to the kids and their education and to the cohesiveness of the society we want to build. So between those two choices, I would let them opt out of particular classes. Don't worry, their friends will tell them what's going to happen in the class anyway. That's the image I was looking for. So you see, someone really needs to do like a media analysis or culture analysis, like how parents stand with their children, like in front of the legislature, holding signs about how innocent their children are, and also placards saying exactly what they're upset about. Like, I have pictures of children holding signs that say math, not masturbation. The child is holding the sign. So I've alluded several times to the rise of parents' rights, and I'm sure this is not news to you. And yeah, it's kind of more pronounced and has more legs south of the border, but it's also, as I mentioned, in Alberta, really actually resulted in substantive policy changes. Okay, I have a whole spiel about parents' rights, and I'm not going to talk about the legal backgrounds. I'm not going to talk about parents' authority over education and other domains. I'm just going to give you a little spiel about what we might think about when we think about parents' rights when it comes to sexuality education. There's a strong intuition that really does cut across the political spectrum, that there's something special about sex, that sexuality has its own value system, that it is more charged or more important than other areas that we might need to educate children in, and that it doesn't fit into school the way that all our other subjects fit into school. Math, Spanish, science, sex. There's something about it that many people, I think, kind of understandably feel is sui generis, to use the Latin phrase, like a category of its own, okay? And that's going to make some parents much more protective of it. There's an organization in Ontario that was started actually just in protest of the curriculum that I mentioned, called Parents as First Educators, PAFE. You can look it up. They actually run political candidates sometimes. And their whole premise is that, teachers can't be teaching my child this. Parents are the first educators. And you know what? Yes, they are. Parents are child's first sex educators. They have to be, because the child is born naked and the parent takes care of them. And don't think that means that all parents are doing what we might think of as sex education from a young age. Remember that not talking about something or using euphemisms instead of accurate words or inducing shame instead of normalizing. These are still sex education. It may not be good sex education, it's still sex education. By the time a child gets to school, even if they're 4 years old, they already have some knowledge and some beliefs about bodies, boundaries, intimacy, and so on. So on the one hand, this is, I think, a very important reason to be sympathetic to parents, okay? Parents are starting from the premise, I'm their first sex educator. Yes, they are. At the same time, you have to ask if parents are equipped to be their only or their final sex educator. Sexuality just generally is, rightly or wrongly, more sensitive and more related to identity and values than I think any other area of curriculum. Like even religion, arguably, in the sense that religion is something more shared, like it's more likely to be held in common by the parents and the child. Sexuality is notoriously individual, notoriously a barrier between the parents and their children, and not something they're likely to talk about openly. And that's going to make it a subject, again, over which parents are likely to exercise more protectiveness. They're more wary of who they let in to that space with their child. It's already a sensitive space for them. It's also, again, rightly or wrongly, just the case that the child's sexual behavior, and I also mean identity and gender expression and things they say at the dinner table or at parties, may affect the whole family or community. And a lot of parents who object to sex education point to this and saying, like, it's not only an intrusion on my right as a parent, it's an intrusion on a kind of way of life that depends on a continuity between, my values and my child's behavior. And if you start telling my child to go behave different ways or that it's okay to do this or that, that may alienate me from my community. I may be shunned. My child might be shunned. There are potentially significant consequences. And again, don't just dismiss parents because they say things you disagree with. Most parents didn't get sex education. I mean, how many people in this room got anything that they would consider comprehensive sex education? I'm guessing like two halves, maybe. Most of us did not get sex education, certainly nothing like what's in the CCQ. Okay, what passed for sex education in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, not at all what passes for sex education now, and thank goodness. But unfortunately, this really introduces or exacerbates an intergenerational rift, which I think is always already present. Like I said, I mean, sex is, even with hippie parents, believe me, like it's still a little awkward to talk about, okay? The intergenerational rift or tension is going to be there. And I think parents really get their backs up. And I've never heard them say this explicitly. This is me doing a bit of like armchair psychoanalysis. But I think they really get their backs up because they don't know this stuff. And because they never got to have like really great sexual experiences as young people. And maybe, they've only ever been with their spouse. And they don't necessarily want their kid to know more than them, to be savvier than them, to be cooler than them, and to be having great sex that they're not having. And you can still love your kid. I'm not saying they don't want the best for their kid. I think it's a very sore spot. And most of us were raised with at least a certain amount of stigma, shame, confusion, and we just kind of fumbled our way through. Parents have a hard time with that. I'm not even adding on the like immigrant experience and other dimensions that can exacerbate that. Okay, now so like I said, I think you have to be sympathetic to where parents are coming from. And I do, in fact, believe that sexuality is different from other school subjects. And I'm also a parent. And I think, to be protective about how your child is talked to about such things makes a certain amount of sense. But what can you say in response? So part of what you can say in response or know in response is, so what are these parents actually doing? Because what you'll hear a lot is, I teach sex education. You don't have to teach it. You're not the right person to teach it. I do it at home. Okay? I'm not going to give you all the references. Just trust me. The evidence is there. Parents who object to school-based sex education do not reliably cover sexual health with their kids. Parents are often misinformed about current topics in sexuality education, Not surprising. I mean, as I said before, this stuff changes a lot. And even in the last 10 years, it's changed astronomically. They're not teachers, they're not experts. It's not surprising. You should have professionals teaching these things, but parents may mistakenly believe that they are informed. Parents, again, across the political spectrum, underestimate their children's actual sexual activities and exposure to pornography. Very important one. When you tell parents the like 11-year-old statistic or other statistics, typically their jaw drops. And it's not because they're conservative or even that they're anti-porn. It's we don't actually appreciate the degree to which our kids' minds have been completely hijacked by technology and capitalism, and the pornography industry is one of the biggest culprits. And there's plenty of evidence that without really, really good comprehensive sex education, porn is sex education. Okay. So parents really mean well, I would say, for the most part, but they think their kid is an exception. They say, oh no, it's the other kids who are having sex. My kid isn't having sex. You know, they should tell the other kids, sure, you know, tell them about safer sex, but you don't need to tell my kid that. Or they think, oh, yeah, well, we'll talk about porn someday. I mean, but she's only like 13. We don't need to talk about it now. Sorry to tell you, girls also learn how to have sex from porn. And the first time heterosexual girls have sex with boys, the boys have been trained on porn. And they both think that what they see in porn is how sex is supposed to be. Sorry. Okay, what you can do. I'm not a teacher. I'm your cheerleader. I'm trying to give you some tools. I can't say how idiot proof any of these things are. And by idiot, of course, I mean like the principal or the crazy protester outside your school. But here's what I think based on what I know you can do. One, familiarize yourself with the research on the effectiveness of comprehensive sexuality education, of which the CCQ is a stellar example, consent education, and gender inclusive and sex positive education. There's avalanches of literature, okay? If you want a comparison, the abstinence only education that they've been doing in the US since 1981, abject failure by its own standards. Like the standard is to get kids to not have sex until marriage, does not work, okay? Tons of evidence on exactly the kinds of practices and strategies that are in your CCQ. So that's a good thing. Two, I would recommend seeking out curricular supports, especially if you haven't taught this kind of thing before. You can get lesson plans, activities, go to experienced sexuality educators. I just did a quick search on Quebec sources that might be useful. The AIDS Community Care of Montreal on its website has free resources that you can use. They've been in the business a while, so that's one place to look. Excuse me. But I would recommend really sharing resources, pooling resources, talking to other people. Just as a lot of parents who mean well aren't very good at talking to their kids about sex, I don't think that even the best intentioned teachers can overnight figure out how to talk about some of these really sensitive topics. Even if you believe in all of it, you didn't have the CCQ 2 years ago. Now you have the CCQ. At what point and where did you suddenly become competent to talk about like negotiating consent between teenagers, or the latest type of gender diversity, or like any of the, it's hard, okay? So be patient with yourself. This is a professional exercise, and there are professionals who have experience and who have resources who hopefully will be made more available to guide you. Third, as I said, I encourage you to be understanding of people's reservations for practical reasons, if not for moral ones. Like when you just have a standoff, between like the for and against the curriculum, people's minds aren't changed. Again, this picks up on everything else that was talked about this morning. I don't need to repeat it, but I wouldn't encourage any kind of standoff approach. Where there is conflict, we've seen the most benefit, the most movement, where people are listened to and where parents' reservations, objections, and so on are validated. And then where you only when they're ready, point to the evidence and say, this is what, like, they're not masturbating in class. This is what it actually says. Or I know you think that your kid hasn't seen porn, but statistically, there's a good chance they have. But they have to get to a kind of place of being heard before you can do that. There I go being an armchair therapist again. But finally, I also encourage being sympathetic in the sense that even when parents or other protesters are really intransigent and they might be saying things that you find not only false, but potentially even hateful. And I saw a lot of this with the homophobia related to the Ontario curriculum. I do think that parents want to protect their kids. I think it's very, very rare that parents aren't actually trying to do what they think is best for their kids. And teachers are trying to do what they think is best for kids. And I think that starting from a place of mutual respect for the well-being of children, even when you disagree about what that means, is a better starting point than, raging at people because they're wrong and they're harming kids. Like that's what the right does to the left. That's what the left does to the right. Pedophilia, gender indoctrination, it's not accomplishing anything. So those would be my takeaways. And I look forward to your questions.